Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to go over Chapter 5, the skeletal system. Now, I was asked by a student if there was any mnemonics to memorize the names of bones. And for sure there are, but here's what I want to kind of go over with you first. NASM is simply not going to ask you a ton of questions on the names of bones or anything related to the specifics of the skeletal system. However, there are some important things you do need to know. And, as I'm looking through this in chapter 5, there's just no way of getting around because NASM tries to keep things as simple, and they've done a great job in their 7th edition, kind of keeping things in a controlled sense without having to go through anatomy physiology with you. But there's really no two ways around it when we're talking about the skeletal system. So certain things you do need to memorize for sure from a testing perspective. As far as all the things you need to know when it comes to the real world of training, there are some key elements that I think you should know. And so I'll go over kind of those two worlds from a testing perspective, as always. And by the way, I'm on page 125 though, so if you want to go to page 125 in your textbook, chapter 5, for sure, when you get to the skeletal system, obviously on the right side, you're going to have your terms, concepts that are very important to memorize. I'm saying from a testing perspective, that's why they've done this for you. So terms such as what the skeletal system is. Here's a very important term, just so you know, osteoporosis or osteopenia. Those are the two conditions where we see a loss of bone mineral density. Osteopenia is sort of the pre-osteoporotic diseased state. Osteoporosis is the actual clinically diagnosed condition based on a reduction in bone density at a certain point. Doctor makes that determination, and you have, quote, osteoporosis, and any number of reasons why that would happen. But what we do know, and this is critically important, is that um, resistance training, putting any sort of increased loads on the muscular system, right, which connect to the skeletal system via tendons and some other soft tissue apparatus, um, for instance, that will affect now the mineral density uptake, or the uptake of minerals to increase mineral density. And so increased loads on the muscular system. Remember, the muscles transfer the loads that are being imposed on them to the tendons on either side of the muscle. And since those tendons insert into the bone, that increased load on muscles transfers to the tendons, to the bones. The bones will adapt. And this is based on what's known as Wolff's Law. The bones will adapt to that stress. Increased density in the particular area where the tendons are at will ultimately lead to full or systemic density increases in that particular bone. Now, then as soon as you say that, now it's helpful to understand a little bit more about the structure of bone, and that's what NASM does. But once you start scratching below the surface on that, boy, you can go into an entire course just on bones, what they're made of, the different types of bones, the trabecular bone, and um, the parts of the long bone. There are components here that are just not critically important from a testing perspective, but I'll do the best I can to kind of help you out to understand. And again, the student that asked me was really looking at page 126 and going, holy cow, figure 5-9. Whoa, do I need to memorize all those muscles? Well, no, not from a testing perspective. I mean, it's not a bad idea to know some of these muscles. And I think what ends up happening, and you can in the comment box tell me if this is this what you're dealing with when you get to this. There's so many moving parts. There's a figure here, there's explanations here, there's subcategories here, types of bones, bone growth. It's sort of like NASM threw a whole bunch of stuff, and they were just trying to figure out how best to sequence it in the textbook. And I would agree that, yeah, because there is a lot of information. And then, of course, they throw their stretch your knowledge box in here, getting technical boxes, it could seem a little out of whack. And so my recommendation when you're studying through this is first of all, number one, no, you don't need to memorize all the bones of the body, the 206 bones of the body. Now, I will say that it's not a bad idea, just for your own edification, to memorize the bones of the appendicular skeleton, which is going to be the bones of the limbs, not necessarily all the bones of the hands and all the bones of the feet, but for sure your humerus, ulnar, radius, got metacarpals. You can memorize that level. Trying to memorize all of the bones of the fingers and the hands and fingers, probably not as necessary. But then, of course, the femur, the upper leg, and the tibia fibula, the lower leg, maybe understanding some of the or memorizing some of the bones of the ankle and foot. So there are some critical areas in there, like the tarsals, the metatarsals, and what's known as the tarsus, which is the 7 bones that comprise that area right below, or that includes the talus bone, which is your heel, right? If you think about it and you look at these pictures, you'll see some terminology that is easier to remember because it's a summary or it's a grouping of bones, and that's what the tarsus is, for instance. But again, without scratching too far below the surface, I would say from a memorization perspective, you might want to just memorize those bones. And then there's what's known as the axial skeleton, which is essentially the skull, bones of the skull, the rib cage, and the vertebral column. Now, again, it's helpful to memorize some of those because you're going to be seeing them further in the book, especially for postural issues. When you're talking about postural control, knowing, right, the 7 cervical vertebrae, the 12 thoracic vertebrae, the 5 lumbar vertebrae, and the coccyx, that's good to know. So I would definitely memorize like those numbers, right? So 7, 12, and 5. That's what you would want to memorize: 7, 12, 5. And that would be very helpful. So the probably easiest way to memorize some of this material then would be to see how they split their divisions and subdivisions in these heading titles. So skeletal system, divisions of the skeletal system. Now, by the way, with any of these chapters and any of these materials, it's a good idea to look at the heading titles first. So in this case, before you start studying, skeletal system is the heading title. It's the main topic. Now there's subtopics, divisions of the skeletal system, bones. And if I keep going, I'm looking for more heading titles, and that might be, okay, so bones, and then the next heading title or subheading occurs on page 134, and that's joints. So normally the way I'll do it is I'll write out skeletal system, divisions, bones, joints, and I'll keep going through the chapter. And I don't see, oh, there we go. Skeletal system life course, exercises impact on bone mass. So you can see all of these subheadings from the main title, which is the skeletal system. It's simply one way to do it, and that takes us to page 139. That's the end of the skeletal system. And then what I would do is I would go back back to my first divisions of the skeletal system, and what are the subheadings of that? Well, it doesn't have any subheadings. It's basically just telling you that there is the axial skeleton, skull, rib cage, vertebral column, and the appendicular skeleton, appendixes, right? The appendages, appendages. So appendicular are all of your limbs. It includes the clavicle, the scapulae, bones of the arms, and bones of the legs. So that's your appendicular skeleton. Also includes the pelvic girdle. The idea that there's 126 bones in the, that's not really that critically important to know. Not a bad idea, I guess, to know there's 206 bones in the adult body, but you would read through that And like I say, in your textbook, bones now has a couple of subheadings. So under bones, you have bone growth, types of bones, and this is how I would navigate through the chapter. Remember, anytime you get to a table, now remember, figures are important. I mean, they are visual descriptions of information. That's all well and good, but from a purely testing perspective, you definitely want to know the tables first and foremost. So table 5.1, types of bones, you would want to memorize that. Now, again, if you want a mnemonic for long, short, flat, irregular, sesamoid, you would do LSFIS. Can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but whatever would work for you, you can write a little sentence with those as the mnemonics that you would use. And as you move through this part of the chapter on the skeletal system, again, NASM has given you some really good basic figures or pictures. So they're telling you about the long bones, short bones, sesamoid bone, things like that. I would definitely look at the getting technical. Nothing wrong with reading through that. It's very interesting information. But so that takes you through the entire section. Most important was what I was going to do this video about, which was simply looking at this one figure, because again, a student had asked me, how do you memorize all these bones? And the answer is, well, it's like memorizing anything else, over and over and over again. What I would do is I would simply break off the two structural components of the skeletal system, the axial skeleton, and just write axial skeleton. And right off the bat, there are three main areas you need to know the bones of: the bones of the skull or the cranium, the rib cage, so the ribs and the sternum, right? And then the vertebral column itself. Very simple, very straightforward. And they actually give you, an easy to, at least in this picture, sternum, ribs. This is your thoracic, what they call your thoracic cage, and then your vertebral column. And that's easy. I think the axial skeleton is probably the easiest from that standpoint. Now, outside of trying to memorize the frontal parietal bones of the skull, the ethmoid, don't worry about that, because the skull itself obviously has these what are known as suture joints. Um, and so there are multiple bones in your skull. And so that's not going to be necessary for sure, because there's no movement associated with them. You're not going through an anatomy physiology course. So you're not trying to understand every single component of the skeletal system. Axial skeleton, pretty straightforward, easy to memorize. Again, skull, cranium, thoracic cage, which would be the sternum and the ribs. Okay. And then the vertebral column itself. And that's going to be the cervical vertebrae, thoracic, right? 7, 12, 5. Okay. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar vertebrae. Now, of course, the axial skeleton is easy. Of course, the appendicular skeleton has more bones that you need to memorize. Now, and I would say this, don't worry so much about all of the bones of the fingers and the hand. That's, again, I would probably go down to the wrist, radius, and the ulnar. Anything further than that is going to be on you if you want to learn that. But again, bones like the humerus, right? The humerus, the clavicle, right? Clavicle, scapulae, scapula 1, scapulae, both of them. Humerus, ulnar, radius. Again, if you want to go down to the carpals and the metacarpals, go for it. Then you have the hip bone, or what we call it, the ilium, right? The hip bone, the femur, the upper leg. Of course, the patella is the kneecap itself. Okay. Then you have the tibia and the fibula. Now, similar to the hands, where you have the carpals, at the feet, we have they're using the word tarsals, metatarsals. Okay. Probably one of the more important bones in the ankle, right? Because you're going to look at this a little bit further on in the book, is going to be the talus bone, and this is going to be helpful when you're talking about kinesiology or the actual movement patterns within planar motion. So if you're going to, and by the way, I was talking about the talus, I meant the calcaneus, which is actually your ankle. So I think earlier on in the video, I'd said the talus was your ankle. It's actually the calcaneus bone. Um, sorry for that. But when you go down to try and memorize these, okay, like I say, you will see these terms a little bit further down, especially because of the kinesiology or the memorization of movement patterns within the planes of motion, sagittal, frontal, transverse planes, as well as then postural distortion issues. Get the idea? So it could be really important to know that. So that's going to be figure 559. Believe it or not, if you were to just write these down over and over and over, you'd be surprised at how fast you can memorize these bones. I know it looks like a lot in this figure and you see all of, but in reality, you can learn it. You can learn it. Most of them you already know. If you've been in, weightlifting or in the fitness field, you probably know a lot of these names of these bones. All you would be doing is adding on to the ones you already know. And I think that should not be an issue. Now, again, there's a lot more in here, but I just wanted to kind of attack this one figure, this, and answer this one question. And I hope it was helpful, because remember, anything you do to memorize one figure, anything you do to help you memorize tables, things like that, you can, of course, now use in other areas of the book. I will say this: as soon as you start getting through all these other chapters, do yourself a big favor. Make sure you're coming back to refresh your memory, because remember, this is only chapter 5. You've got 23 chapters, so you better make sure you remember this information. So if this was helpful, please write the word understand in the comments section. Remember to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. Very helpful for us, obviously. We will see you next week. Got any questions? Just write them in the comments section below. Have a great week. See you.